Hey there. So in this video, we are going to fill in our characteristics of life notes, which is packet pages 167 and 168. So we're going to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different characteristics that all living organisms have. So let's start with energy utilization. So in our notes, that's in the top left corner. So organisms have different ways of obtaining their energy. They're generally classified in two groups. You have autotrophs, which are organisms that get their energy from sunlight, but you also have autotrophs that get energy from inorganic chemical compounds. So you can have a photoautotroph that uses sunlight, and you can also have a chemoautotroph that gets its energy from chemicals. But a traditional example of an autotroph is plants. The other way we can get energy is being a heterotroph. Heterotrophs get their energy by breaking down organic molecules that come from other living things. So basically this means that heterotrophs, they have to go and eat other things in order to get energy. The second characteristic is that all organisms are made of cells. So this is kind of the top right of our page. Organisms can be made of just one cell, or they can be made of multiple cells. Unicellular organisms are organisms that have just one cell, and the standard example is bacteria. Multicellular organisms are made of more than one cell, so two or more cells. But typically, multicellular organisms like frogs and pea plants or trees, they are made of millions and billions of cells. And then we also have organisms that are colonial, meaning they are made of a colony of smaller, close to identical individuals that function together like a multicellular organism. And a good example of this is the volvox, which is from the protist kingdom. Next, we have internal regulation and order. So organisms have organized, regulated insides. So inside the cells, we have different parts of the cell, which are the organelles, and those organelles perform different functions for the cell. So these organelles include things like the mitochondria and the cell wall. The cells and tissues and organs also perform different functions. So you can have cells that become nerve cells or a muscle cell. And then internal regulation is organisms that maintain conditions inside their organs, organ systems, and cells, adjusting for external effects. So organisms maintain an internal balance that we call homeostasis. So for example, we maintain our body temperatures. The average body temperature is 98.7. And so if we go above that temperature, then you would have a fever. And if you are below that temperature, we call that hypothermia. So maintaining internal balance of body temperature is an example of homeostasis. The next characteristic we're going to look at is respond to the environment. So living things will respond to a stimuli in their environment. And then a few examples of different stimuli. So for example, changes in temperature, we would respond by sweating or shivering to try to maintain our body temperature. We respond to light, sound, and chemical composition of surroundings. So for example, if you come in contact with an irritant you can develop a rash on your skin. And we also respond to humidity and moisture levels, as well as touch or contact with the living world around us. Organisms also reproduce, and we pass on traits through heredity. So there are organisms reproduce to create new organisms there are two different methods. The first is sexual reproduction, which is the reproduction of new living organisms from the genetic information of two different individual parents. So an example of an organism that would use sexual reproduction, that would be frogs, but we could also include humans. You have to have a male and a female parent exchange genetic information, and we say that they have, males have sperm and females have eggs. The other type of reproduction is asexual reproduction, and this is the reproduction of new living organisms that inherit genetic information from only one parent. So an example of an organism that reproduces asexually would be bacteria. So a single bacterium can use binary fission to reproduce itself. So you go from having one parent, it goes through binary fission, and now it has one offspring. And so we went from having one bacteria to two. And then those two bacteria would do asexual reproduction again, and you'd end up with four, and so on and so forth. The next characteristic is growth and development. So organisms grow and develop during their lifetime. So growth is cells within the organism. They take in nutrients and get bigger, but most growth happens through a process called cell division in order to produce more cells. So organisms can grow by the cells becoming larger, but at some point the cells can't get any bigger, and so we will actually use cell division to produce more cells so that you can grow taller, over the course of your lifetime. And living things also develop. So they change form in their development into adulthood as cells differentiate. So the example here with a frog, you start out as a tadpole, and then you go through different stages of development until you reach adulthood, in which we would say you're now a frog. So you go from tadpole to frog. And these cells differentiate into the organ and organ systems that we need for the adult to survive. Organisms also evolve and adapt. So populations of organisms change over time to adapt to their environment. And different characteristics that help them live and reproduce are passed to their offspring. This process is called natural selection. So frogs, if I look at the back of the frog, it's spotted, with different colors of green. So that's an adaptation to help that frog blend into its environment so that hopefully it won't get eaten by different predators. And that adaptation is passed to its offspring through a process of natural selection. The frogs that are best adapted to the environment will survive and reproduce, and frogs that are not very well adapted to their environment, they probably won't survive, and if they do, they might not have as many offspring as frogs that are well adapted to their environment. Last thing we're going to talk about are viruses. So viruses are kind of in this weird gray zone between living and non-living. Viruses are not made of cells. They are life molecular machinery that invade host cells. They are like, typo, they are like molecular machinery that invade host cells and then use the host cell's machinery to reproduce more virus or more machines. So viruses are just molecular machinery that invade a cell and then they take over the cell in order to reproduce themselves. So we're going to go through each of these characteristics to see if viruses have that characteristic or not. So the first characteristic was energy. Viruses do not eat or obtain any energy. Viruses do not sense their environment. They do not respond to heat or touch or light. And viruses do not grow or develop. They do not get bigger and they do not go through a life cycle. They are simply built, right, like a machine. Viruses are copied by the host cell, so they do not reproduce themselves, but instead they force their host to make more copies. Again, just like an assembly line would make more parts of a machine. And internal regulation and order, viruses do have specific simple structures, but they do not maintain homeostasis. So they cannot keep their machinery at a stable temperature. So if you run a fever, the virus cannot adjust for that and it will no longer be able to survive. And evolution and adaptation, viruses can evolve as the host cell makes a mistake in copying the virus's genetic info. And so the virus's DNA or RNA can change because of those mistakes. Remember, we called that DNA mutations. So are viruses living? Most evolutionary biologists would say no, because they do not meet all of these requirements that other living things like frogs or humans do meet. So that is it for this lesson, for these notes. If you have any questions or concerns about the characteristics of life, please let me know. Thanks.